I speak 9 languages, the Jewish girl said proudly. The millionaire laughs, but is shocked. Look who showed up here. David Steinberg laughed out loud as he watched the 14-year-old girl standing at the entrance to the main hall of the Wealthmax Corporation. The cleaning lady's daughter who thinks she can take part in our internship program for young talent. The echo of David's cruel laughter filled the luxurious atmosphere of the 47th floor, where dozens of teenagers from expensive private schools nervously awaited their interviews for the most popular internship program in Manhattan. Rachel Goldstein felt all the heads turn in her direction, but she remained strangely calm. Rachel was only 14 and never imagined that she would be there, competing with children of New York's elite for an opportunity that could completely change her life. Her mother, Sarah, had worked as a night janitor in the building for 6 years, cleaning the offices of the same executives who now looked at her with barely concealed contempt. Really, girl? David continued, adjusting his $80,000 Rolex watch. Do you really believe that someone like you has a chance here? This program is for exceptional young people, not for. He gestured vaguely in her direction, charity cases. The silence in the hall was deafening. The other candidates, all from Dalton School, Horace Mann and other prestigious institutions, watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. David Steinberg, at 52, was the multimillionaire heir to the Steinberg & Associates real estate empire, and his arrogance was as well known as his fortune of $800 million. But there was something in Rachel's posture that David couldn't decipher. For years, working in that building in the early hours of the morning, she had silently observed meetings through the glass doors, absorbing conversations in different languages, memorizing entire corporate presentations while pretending to be just mopping the floor. "I'm sorry, sir," Rachel replied, her voice firm despite her public humiliation. But the program announcement said it was open to all Manhattan high school students, regardless of school. Technically, yes, David shrugged, visibly enjoying the discomfort of the situation. But let's be realistic here. Do you think you have the necessary qualifications to compete with these young people? He pointed at the other candidates. They speak multiple languages, have private tutors, have traveled all over the world. David stood up from his executive chair and walked towards Rachel like a predator circling its prey. Let me ask you a simple question. How many languages do you speak? And please don't count bad public school English. The other candidates laughed nervously, some taking discreet photos with their cell phones to post on social media later. Rachel could feel the heat of humiliation rising to her face, but there was something different in her eyes, a spark that David was far from understanding. Besides, David continued, clearly savoring every moment, this internship requires interactions with international clients. We need young people who can represent our company anywhere in the world. Have you ever left Manhattan in your life? It was then that Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room full of privileged teenagers who looked at her with superiority. 4 years, while her mother cleaned those offices, she had studied in every public library in the city, used every free language app available, watched every online educational video she could find. In fact, she said with a calmness that surprised even herself, I speak 9 languages fluently. David's laughter stopped abruptly, as if someone had turned off a switch. He blinked several times, processing what he had just heard. The whole room fell completely silent. 9 languages? He repeated, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. Are you kidding me? English, Hebrew, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, German, French, Italian and Portuguese, Rachel listed calmly, pronouncing each language with the perfect fluency of a native. I can demonstrate any of them if you like. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer embarrassment, it was pure shock. David Steinberg, who had spent his entire life using his wealth to intimidate others, was being confronted by a 14-year-old teenager who had just revealed skills that he would never possess, even with all his millions. One of the candidates whispered to his friend, "Wait, did she speak Arabic? My $500 an hour private tutor said Arabic was impossible to learn without traveling to the Middle East." Rachel stood firm in the center of that room where prejudice and privilege reigned supreme, like someone guarding a secret even more powerful than any of them could have imagined. Because what none of them knew was that that display of linguistic skills was just the tip of the iceberg of everything she had absorbed over years of silent observation in that same environment. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming prejudice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what David would discover about Rachel over the next few hours would make her initial humiliation seem like just a warm-up for the most expensive lesson of her privileged life. David blinked several times, as if trying to process an impossible mathematical equation. 9 languages. A 14-year-old girl, the daughter of a janitor, had just claimed to have mastered more languages than he could learn in 10 lifetimes, even with all his fortune. "You're lying," he declared, his voice regaining some of its former arrogance. "It's not possible. A person of your situation simply doesn't have access to that kind of education." Rachel remained calm, but something dangerous flashed in her eyes. "Do you want me to prove it, Mr. Steinberg?" "Of course I do," David laughed, returning to his executive chair. "Let's see that act. Say something in, let's say Mandarin. And don't come with an eye how that every tourist knows." Rachel took a deep breath and began to speak in fluent Mandarin, her impeccable pronunciation echoing through the silent hall. She recited a classic poem by Li Bai about persistence in the face of adversity, each word pronounced with the precision of someone who had spent years studying not only the language, but its profound culture. The silence that followed was awkward. 2 of the elite candidates had taken private Mandarin lessons and managed to understand enough fragments to realize that Rachel wasn't just speaking the language, she was mastering it completely. "Coincidence," David muttered, clearly shaken but determined to maintain his superior position. "Anyone can memorize a few phrases. How about Arabic? I bet you've never even seen the Arabic alphabet in your life." It was then that Rachel did something no one expected. She walked over to the whiteboard on the wall and started writing in Arabic, her hands moving with the elegance of someone who had practiced those characters thousands of times. As she wrote, she simultaneously translated into English. "This is a quote from Khalil Gibran," she explained, finishing the writing. "Generosity does not lie in giving me something I need more than you, but in giving me what you need more than me." David felt something strange happening in his stomach. It wasn't just surprise. It was the first trace of something he hadn't felt for decades, genuine insecurity. How was it possible that this girl, whose mother cleaned corporate toilets, had access to knowledge that cost fortunes to acquire? "Where the hell did you learn all this?" he asked, his mask of superiority beginning to slip. "At the Manhattan Public Library," Rachel replied simply. "International section, 3rd floor. They have free conversation programs in 15 different languages, every day of the week. While my mother worked here in the early hours, I studied there in the afternoons." The revelation hit David like a punch in the gut. The public library. Free programs. While he was spending thousands of dollars on private tutors for his own children, who could barely hold a basic conversation in Spanish, this girl had built up a linguistic arsenal using resources he didn't even know existed. "This is ridiculous," he exploded, standing up abruptly. "You would have me believe that a public library offers a better education than the most expensive schools in Manhattan?" "Not better," Rachel corrected calmly. "Just more accessible for those who really want to learn. The difference is that I needed to learn. You just wanted to have one more line on your CV." The remark cut deep. David looked around the room at the other candidates, spoiled young people who had never had to fight for anything in their lives, who treated education as just another luxury accessory to impress at society parties. "You know what?" David said, his voice taking on a venomous tone. "Even if you speak 100 languages, that doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here. This program is for young people who understand the business world, who have grown up in successful environments. You can speak all the languages you want, but you'll never understand how real power works." Rachel smiled for the first time since she had entered the room. It was a small smile, but there was something about it that made David feel inexplicably nervous. "Mr. Steinberg," she said, her voice taking on a different quality, "have you ever heard of game theory? Behavioral economics? Or does business just mean inheriting an estate built up by your grandfather?" The silence that followed was absolutely deadly. David felt his face burn with humiliation. This 14-year-old girl had just questioned not only his knowledge, but the legitimacy of his entire social position. "How dare you?" he began, but Rachel interrupted him. "For the last 3 years, while my mother cleaned this office, I watched your meetings through the glass doors," she said calmly. "I've seen how you treat employees, how you make decisions, how you conduct negotiations. I've also seen the results of those decisions in the financial reports that sit on your desk." David felt the blood drain from his face. You were spying on me?" I was learning, Rachel corrected. And you know what I discovered? That inherited wealth is not synonymous with entrepreneurial competence. In fact, it's almost always the opposite. The other candidates watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and terror. They had never witnessed anyone challenging David Steinberg so directly, let alone a working-class teenager. That's enough, David declared, his voice shaking with anger. You're disqualified. Leave my company now, before I call security. Rachel remained exactly where she was. Based on what? I've demonstrated proficiency in multiple languages, knowledge of advanced economic theories, and practical observation of the corporate environment. What exactly are the criteria for disqualification? David opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. For the first time in decades, he didn't have an answer. Worse still, he knew that everyone in the room was noticing his intellectual inadequacy being exposed by a child. But what David didn't know was that Rachel was still just warming up. During years of silent observation, she had absorbed much more than languages and economic theories. She had uncovered secrets about the Steinberg family's questionable business practices that could destroy much more than just David's inflated ego. There, in the center of that hall where arrogance and privilege reigned supreme, Rachel stood her ground like someone with information capable of turning humiliation into revenge and prejudice into justice. Because what none of them imagined was that the real demonstration of power was just beginning, and that underestimating a young woman who had survived years in social invisibility would be the most expensive mistake David Steinberg would make in his entire privileged life. You want to know about criteria? David growled, his face red with humiliation. I'll give you very clear criteria. This program is for young people who understand social hierarchy, who know how to respect authority. You've just demonstrated that you don't possess any of those qualities. Rachel remained motionless, but something changed in her posture. Over the years of observing that environment, she had learned that men like David interpreted calmness as submission. It was a mistake she was about to fully exploit. I fully understand the hierarchy here, Mr. Steinberg, she replied with a serenity that made some candidates exchange nervous glances. You are at the top because you inherited a fortune built by other people, and you use that position to intimidate those you consider inferior. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Interesting observation about social structures based on inherited capital versus meritocracy. The voice came from the entrance to the hall, where an elegant man of about 60 was watching the scene with genuine interest. Professor Jonathan Mitchell, Harvard Business School. I've come to observe the selection process at the invitation of the board. David paled instantly. Professor Mitchell was a legend in the academic world, the author of dozens of books on leadership and business ethics. His presence there had not been announced, and clearly David was not prepared to have an outside observer witness his display of prejudice. Professor Mitchell, David stammered, trying to regain his composure. We didn't expect. It's an honor to have you here. The honor is mine, Mitchell replied, his eyes still focused on Rachel. Especially to witness such an enlightening discussion about power dynamics in the modern corporate environment. Rachel felt a twinge of hope. During her years of solitary study, she had read all of Mitchell's books available in the library. His theories on authentic leadership were exactly what she had observed in practice over the years in that office. In fact, Mitchell continued, addressing Rachel directly, your observation about merit-based hierarchies versus hereditary privilege echoes theories I discuss in my MBA courses. Where do you know these concepts from? Mostly from your books, Professor, Rachel replied, feeling David wince next to her. I read The Authentic Leader in the public library last year. Mitchell smiled genuinely. And what did you think of the theory about inherited incompetence, the tendency for heirs to show less leadership ability? Rachel glanced briefly at David before answering. I think it's a theory that's confirmed every day in the corporate world, Professor. When success is inherited, not developed, it is usually accompanied by an excessive need for validation through the humiliation of others. The answer was an elegant and precise stab. David knew he was being intellectually dissected by a 14-year-old in front of one of the country's most respected academics. Fascinating, Mitchell muttered, making notes in a small notebook. And what's your perspective on corporate social responsibility in relation to social mobility? David should have been able to answer this question fluently, considering his position. Instead, he remained silent, realizing that anything he said would immediately be compared to Rachel's articulation. I believe that corporations have the power, and therefore the moral obligation, to break cycles of inequality, Rachel replied. When a company chooses to hire only people from certain social circles, it is perpetuating systems that limit both human potential and innovation itself. Mr. Steinberg, Mitchell said, turning to David with an expression that managed to be both courteous and devastating at the same time. How would you assess this candidate's performance so far? David opened and closed his mouth several times. Any negative answer would be transparently based on prejudice. Any positive answer would be to admit that he had been outdone by a teenager. She demonstrated some interesting knowledge, he finally muttered. Interesting, Mitchell repeated, as if tasting the flavor of the word. A remarkably moderate description for someone who demonstrated fluency in 9 languages and advanced understanding of economic theory. During this conversation, Rachel had noticed something important. The other candidates, young men from the elite who until minutes before had looked at her with disdain, were now watching her with something that seemed like respect mixed with nervousness. For the first time, they were realizing that they might not be the most qualified candidates in the room. Tell me, Mr. Steinberg, Mitchell continued, how many languages do you speak fluently? The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. David had spent the last hour trying to diminish Rachel's language skills, and now he was being forced to admit his own limitations. English, and a bit of French, he confessed, his voice almost inaudible. A little French, Mitchell repeated. And you consider this background adequate for a company that operates internationally? Rachel watched the whole scene with a mixture of satisfaction and something akin to pity. For the first time in her life, she was witnessing a powerful man being subjected to the same kind of humiliating scrutiny that he regularly inflicted on others. But she also knew that this was only the first victory in a much bigger war. David Steinberg was not the kind of man who would accept being publicly humiliated and simply move on. He would try to get revenge. He would try to find ways to destroy his chances. What David didn't know was that Rachel had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. All those nights while her mother cleaned those offices, she hadn't just studied languages. She had also carefully documented questionable business practices and conversations that should never have taken place in front of an invisible janitor. There, in the center of that room where privilege and real competence were being separated for the first time in decades, Rachel stood firm as one who possessed not only superior intelligence, but also information that could turn that initial humiliation into something much more devastating. Because while David had completely underestimated the girl he considered inferior, she had been watching, learning and gathering evidence for a confrontation that was only just beginning to reveal its true destructive scope. You know what, Mr. Steinberg? Rachel said calmly, taking out a small digital recorder from her school bag. Over all these years of observing your meetings, I've learned that successful entrepreneurs always document everything. So I decided to follow that example. The blood drained completely from David's face. What is this? It's 3 years of recordings, Rachel replied, placing the device on the table where everyone could see it. Conversations that took place in this office while my invisible mother was cleaning around. Conversations about tax evasion, fraudulent contracts with City Hall, bribes to get building permits. Professor Mitchell leaned forward, his academic interest now transformed into something much more serious. Those are pretty serious charges, young man. They're not accusations, Professor. They're documented facts. Rachel pulled out a folder from her bag, organized with the precision of an experienced lawyer. I have copies of emails that Mr. Steinberg printed out and forgot in the printer, photographs of documents that were left on his desk, records of bank transfers to offshore accounts. David was visibly shaking now. You can't have the account in the Cayman Islands under your ex-wife's name? Rachel asked innocently. International Trust Bank, account number 847392B? Or would you prefer me to mention the $12 million in undeclared taxes from the last 5 years? The silence in the hall was deafening. The other candidates watched the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination, realizing that they were witnessing the complete destruction of one of the most powerful men in Manhattan. That's illegal, David stammered desperately. You can't record private conversations without consent. Actually, Professor Mitchell interjected with a cold smile, in New York State, only one party needs to consent to the recording. And technically, Rachel was present during all these conversations as the daughter of an employee authorized to be in the building. Rachel nodded. Also, whistleblowing about criminal activity is protected by federal law. especially when it involves tax fraud that jeopardizes public funds intended for education. David tried to regain some control of the situation. Even if that were true, who would believe a 14-year-old girl against me? I have lawyers, influence, connections. You did, Rachel corrected gently. Because 15 minutes before I got here, I sent complete copies of all that documentation to the Internal Revenue Service, the FBI, the New York State Attorney General's office, and... She paused dramatically, to the journalists at the New York Times and Wall Street Journal who were investigating corruption in public construction contracts. David's cell phone started ringing insistently. Then Mitchell's. Then the phones of several other executives began to vibrate simultaneously throughout the office. Apparently, Rachel observed with unearthly calm, the story is already being published online. David picked up his phone with trembling hands. The first call was from his accountant, the second from his lawyer, the third from a journalist. His eyes quickly scanned the avalanche of email notifications. You destroyed my life, he whispered, his face now completely ashen. No, Rachel replied with a dignity that contrasted brutally with David's despair. You destroyed your own life with your choices. I just documented those choices and made them public. Professor Mitchell was typing furiously on his phone. David, I just got a call from the Harvard board. They are immediately revoking your appointment as an honorary member and canceling your lecture next week. And that's just the beginning, Rachel added, consulting her own cell phone. From what I see in the news, the public prosecutor's office has already obtained warrants to freeze your bank accounts. The stock exchange has suspended trading in Steinberg and Associates shares, and City Hall has canceled all ongoing contracts. David slumped in his executive chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting him full force. In a matter of minutes, he had gone from respected tycoon to criminal under federal investigation. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why did you do it? Rachel stared at him with a serenity that seemed impossible in someone so young. Because for years I watched you humiliate hard-working people like my mother. I saw how you treated employees like disposable objects. I watched you steal public money that was supposed to fund schools, hospitals, social programs. She paused, allowing her words to resonate through the silent hall. But mostly because I believed that a person with your power and resources could make a positive difference in the world, and instead you chose to use it all to feed your own ego and bank account. Professor Mitchell looked at Rachel with something approaching reverence. Young lady, do you have any interest in studying law at Harvard? Because after what I've witnessed here today, I can assure you that our university would be honored to have you. David raised his head sharply. You can't be offering her a scholarship. Actually, Mitchell smiled, I'm offering much more than that. I'm offering an opportunity to someone who clearly understands that true power comes with moral responsibility. Rachel smiled for the first time in the whole confrontation. Thank you very much, Professor. I'd be honored. As police car sirens began to sound in the distance and the building's elevators filled with federal agents ascending to the 47th floor, David Steinberg remained paralyzed in his chair, watching an empire built on corruption and arrogance crumble in real time. There, in the center of that hall where minutes before prejudice disguised as tradition reigned, a new reality was taking shape. The girl who had been underestimated for her humble origins was now being courted by the most prestigious university in the country, while the man who had humiliated her faced the prospect of years in federal prison. Because sometimes justice doesn't come alone. It needs someone brave enough to document the truth and smart enough to choose the perfect moment to reveal it to the world. 6 months later, Rachel Goldstein was walking through the historic corridors of Harvard Law School, carrying books that cost more than her mother earned in a month as a janitor. The irony didn't go unnoticed. The girl who had been humiliated for not belonging to the elite was now studying at the country's most prestigious university on a full scholarship. David Steinberg, on the other hand, was spending his days in a federal cell awaiting trial on 47 counts of tax fraud and money laundering. His lawyers had only managed to postpone the inevitable, a sentence of up to 25 years in prison. The investigation uncovered a corruption scheme that spanned more than a decade, explained the CNN reporter on the television in the Harvard Library where Rachel was studying. Evidence provided by an anonymous source, later identified as a minor who preferred not to identify herself, led to the largest real estate corruption scandal in Manhattan history. Professor Mitchell, who had become Rachel's official mentor, approached with a stack of newspapers. Did you see? The Wall Street Journal devoted 3 whole pages to the case. They're calling you the youngest whistleblower in American corporate history. Rachel smiled discreetly. I'd rather just be called a law student. Modesty won't change the fact that you dismantled a $200 million criminal scheme using nothing but patience, intelligence, and moral courage, Mitchell observed, taking a seat next to her. Harvard has received 847 transfer applications this semester alone. It seems his story has inspired some young people to believe that meritocracy still exists. The impact of the case had spread far beyond the corporate world. Sarah Goldstein, Rachel's mother, had been promoted to facility management supervisor at WealthMax Corporation, which was now run by a new CEO committed to ethical practices. The company had implemented a scholarship program for employees' children and completely changed its corporate culture. You know what's most satisfying? Rachel asked, closing her constitutional law book. It's not seeing David in prison or knowing that he's lost everything. It's knowing that more than 200 working families have achieved real opportunities because of the changes that have taken place. Professor Mitchell nodded. The best revenge really is to live well, and make sure others can live well too. Just then, Rachel's cell phone vibrated with a notification. It was an email from a documentary production company wanting to tell her story, followed by invitations to speak at 3 different universities. Companies from all over the country were looking for her to consult on corporate ethics, even though she was just a freshman law student. Professor, she said, showing the invitations, how does a 14-year-old girl become a national reference on corporate justice in 6 months? Simple, Mitchell replied with a smile. You proved that age, social background, and bank account don't determine a person's worth. You showed that true leadership comes from character, not inherited privilege. Meanwhile, in a federal cell on the other side of the country, David Steinberg was reading a letter from his own son, severing all family ties. Steinberg and Associates had filed for bankruptcy, his properties were seized by the government to compensate for unpaid taxes, and his ex-wife had publicly revealed years of emotional abuse that she had silently documented. The man who once controlled an $800 million empire now possessed only the orange prison uniform and the bitter realization that he had been destroyed by a teenage girl he had considered inferior. The irony, Rachel later reflected during an interview for the Harvard Law Review, is that David was right about one thing all along: this world really is about meritocracy. He just never imagined that he would be judged by the same standards he used to humiliate others. Rachel's story had become legend in academic and corporate circles. Universities invited her to lecture on ethics, companies consulted her on inclusive practices, and young people across the country saw her as proof that the system could still work when brave people decided to do the right thing. 6 months after that devastating day on the 47th floor, Rachel received the first of many awards to come, the National Youth Ethics Award, presented personally by the Attorney General of the United States. As a child, she said in her acceptance speech, I learned that there are 2 kinds of power in the world: power over others and power for others. David Steinberg chose the first and discovered that it is temporary and destructive. I chose the second and discovered that it is permanent and transformative. The audience of 2,000 rose to their feet in ovation. At the back of the auditorium, Sarah Goldstein wept with pride, remembering the nights she cleaned offices while her daughter studied in the library, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. The lesson was clear and powerful. In a world where privilege often masks incompetence and arrogance, only true excellence prevails. Rachel had proved that when you combine genuine intelligence with moral courage, you don't just win, you change the whole game for generations to come. If this story of justice and overcoming has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true revenge is not about destroying your enemies, but building a legacy they could never imagine achieving.